we as the general public don't have clear transparency into how AI is used in real-time operations. Neither does Anthropic, and I think that's their concern.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth held a high-stakes meeting with Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei and, according to several news reports, delivered an ultimatum. Either Anthropic drops the safety guardrails built into its AI model Claude, or it faces potentially punishing consequences. At issue are Anthropic's terms of service for Claude, which prohibit the model from being used to develop or deploy lethal autonomous weapon systems, so-called killer robots that can identify and strike targets without meaningful human oversight. The Pentagon wants a free hand to potentially use Claude to develop these systems. Anthropic wants to prevent Claude from doing so. At time of recording on Thursday, February 26, the outcome of this dispute is unknown, but it is highly consequential, potentially even for the future of humanity. So-called swarms of drones and other military hardware could operate autonomously, coordinating among themselves to kill with impunity. The Pentagon worries that if it doesn't develop these systems, China might. Anthropic considers these systems an ethically abhorrent line it does not want to cross. Joining me to discuss the details of this clash between a leading AI company and the Pentagon is Anna Hare, head of military AI governance at the Future of Life Institute. We kick off with a discussion of how AI systems are already integrated into the U.S. military, before turning to a longer conversation about the vast implications of whether Anthropic complies with the Pentagon's ultimatum. We also discuss how this incident illustrates the need for international agreements on lethal autonomous weapon systems, including a potential treaty now being hashed out at the United Nations. We recorded this conversation live via Substack, and we recorded it about a day before the Pentagon said its ultimatum was due. So the outcome of this threat is not yet known at time of recording, but this conversation will give you very helpful context for understanding this dispute as it unfolds. Now here is my conversation with Anna Hare, head of military AI governance at the Future of Life Institute. Before we get into the details and implications of this dispute between the Pentagon and the proprietor of what is regarded as the most advanced AI model, can I have you just explain and give some background to listeners on how the U.S. military already integrates AI into its work as best we know it?
The US military and other militaries around the world have begun to use AI for various tasks and domains. Some of them like simple chatbot tasks like what we do in our civilian lives, for HR, admin, logistics, planning and strategy, all the way up to automated targeting, autonomous weapon systems, and AI in nuclear command and control. So it's a very broad range of use. Some of them are not so nefarious or seem not so harmful, and some of them are of concern. Some companies are selling concrete hardware and software, so that would look like, for example, an autonomous weaponized drone. And other products that are being sold are just the software. So, for example, a large language model, such as Claude, or others that we use in our own lives. A new recent capability that I've seen recently is the Pentagon's open call for companies to provide a product that translate voice commands into digital instructions that would command swarms of autonomous drones. So new capabilities are popping up regularly, but that's the broad scope of how militaries are looking or currently using AI.
And there has been some reporting, though it seemed vague to me, that somehow some of these models were used in the recently executed operation to capture Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. What do we know about that?
For now, it's hearsay, not verified. It's reported, it's alleged. And again, it could be for the navigation of particular vehicles. It could be for the HR payment of the commanders that participated. It could also be for autonomous weapons used to kill particular humans. We don't know, but it is reported that somehow Claude was used in Venezuela.
So, Claude does have this integration already with the US military, but you saw this apparently, high stakes meeting between Pete Hegseth and Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, earlier this week, leading to this ultimatum. The last reporting I saw is that Anthropic had until Friday at 5:01 p.m. to agree to this ultimatum. Can you just kind of describe what is happening? Like, what do we know about Anthropic's arguments and the guardrails that they seek to preserve and what the Pentagon is seeking to doing? Kind of set up the sides here.
Anthropic has been looking to build client relationships with the US public sector for some time. This isn't new, and they're not against their systems being used by the US military. So this is still a tonal shift from previous years where tech companies were against this. So we're in a different nuance here. There's a $200 million contract with the Pentagon, but they also have partnerships, for example, with Palantir to collaborate on specific areas of work. Claude is surpassing other LLMs in capabilities. So the Pentagon wants to use Claude. That is very clear. And up until this week, Claude was the only LLM to be used in the Pentagon's classified cloud network. So that shows how important it is. Now, this week, they've struck a deal with xAI to use Grok on the classified defense network. So this is shifting. But Anthropic's guidelines, their internal and public guidelines state they don't want their systems used for mass surveillance or for fully autonomous weapons. In fact, Dario Amodei has gone on the record, even recently, describing the envisioning of swarms of a fully autonomous drones as a crime against humanity. So there's been pretty strong ethical positioning as to where their red lines are. So the exact terms and conditions of the contract and the obligations and conditions are not made public, but we can imagine or think of some of the concerns. There would be, for example, liability or misuse. Is Anthropic liable for unlawful use or misuse? Does Anthropic have the right to audit or withdraw access if their policies are violated? We do know that the Pentagon is now inserting a clause in all contracts going forward that they will use a company's product for any lawful use. So that is their determination of what is lawful. So that is what is causing Anthropic some issues, this carte blanche, if you will, of how the Pentagon would like to use their systems.
I want listeners to better understand what we mean by lethal autonomous weapon systems and drone swarms. And I would say if you want to go deeper into this topic, Anna, you and I had a conversation last spring about this very topic on the sidelines of a United Nations meeting attempting to introduce some strategies to regulate lethal autonomous weapon systems. Just set up the problem, though, for us, for those who are unaware.
The Department of War internally does have several policies on AI for mass surveillance and also fully autonomous uses of lethal force. This was enshrined under the Biden administration and also Trump, but they contain some waivers that override the need for appropriate levels of human judgment. This does exist on paper. There is an attempt, but it's similar to this idea of what is lawful use and is it unrestricted. So what are autonomous weapon systems? They are any weapon system that can autonomously select, target, and engage. So that means without human intervention. And Anthropic's red lines on these systems reflect general public's opposition to autonomous weapons and automated targeting. We're seeing there was a recent Politico poll that showed only 26% of people in the US, the UK, Canada, and France felt that militaries should rely on AI for this level of decision making. So there is an overwhelming rejection that AI should make that ultimate decision without meaningful human control. On a more technological level, these systems are unpredictable and brittle at their core. They cannot recognize who is a combatant, who is a child, or the act of surrendering. And even if they do in the future, this capability could be used for genocide, proliferation, extrajudicial killings, terrorist attacks. So you can't always win, even if we reach that sort of golden capability of precision. Now, within militaries, I think there is a difference with the public messaging we're getting from senior officials and then internally military culture around they also don't want to use systems that are unpredictable or uncontrollable. There are big national security risks and global security risks to use autonomous weapons or targeting that is uncontrollable. And these risks sit parallel to the ethical risks as well. So there is some nuance in that maybe military is not stating publicly or as publicly in a way that we would see that they also look at some of the security concerns around the unpredictability of these systems. But from a military utility or a standpoint, you don't want to use systems that are unpredictable or uncontrollable.
Hmm.
So there is convergence.
And specifically on drone swarms, what are drone swarms?
There's no definition of what constitutes a swarm. It could be 5, 10, 50, but it is a multiple number of, the technical term is multi-agents. So it is usually drones, munitions, or ground vehicles that operate together with minimal or little human involvement or supervision. So they can operate with each other in terms of navigation, transferring data to each other in terms of targeting, and then also the engaging, which means the strike. So studies show that even the most competent military commander who is trained can cognitively control up to about 7 to 9 systems at a time, knowing what they're doing, having what we call meaningful human control. Anything above that, it's difficult to say that a human has control over it. So there is a serious accountability gap when you start to use these systems in swarms.
And so it would appear, I mean, based on the reporting thus far, that the Pentagon does not want any of these restrictions against potentially using Claude to operate drone swarms or using Claude to develop one way or another, like lethal autonomous weapon systems, those kind of weapons that operate without meaningful human control. But Claude and Anthropic, they have their kind of internal guidelines saying that, no, this is like an ethical line that we won't cross. So, it's setting up this kind of really huge dispute and a really like high stakes showdown between, I mean, on the one hand, the policies of a democratically elected government, on the other hand, like the internal policies of a massive tech company. How do you interpret what's happening here and the stakes at play in this dispute right now?
I think it shows there's a significant governance gap when private companies like Anthropic are openly calling for restrictions over the use of their own technology. It shows how desperate and urgent the situation is. It's sort of an inversion of the calling for who wants regulation and who doesn't. As you said, the stakes are incredibly high. It's not so much the loss of a $200 million contract, because when you look at Anthropic's annual revenue, that's not too painful for them. The issue is that they would be classified as a supply chain risk, which is previously given to the US's adversaries, like foreign adversaries. What that would mean is that any vendor that uses Claude or Anthropic systems, which includes Palantir, for example, would have to disclose that to the Pentagon and then stop that collaboration or those contracts. So this would be pretty massive for Anthropic. We just saw yesterday that the Pentagon has begun to ask contractors such as Boeing, Lockheed and Martin to disclose how reliant they are on Anthropic products. So the Pentagon is also doing their own assessments of what would it mean for them. Now, I think there's an undermining of public trust, but also corporate trust. we as the general public don't have clear transparency into how AI is used in real-time operations. Neither does Anthropic. And I think that's their concern. They can assert their own usage policy, but that doesn't mean they know how their systems will be used. And there's a broader issue that there are no assurances that the US military operations or national security operations in and of themselves are legal, let alone the use of AI in weapon systems. So there's an issue of accountability and transparency that affects, we're seeing private companies as well as the global public, general public.
And the other threat that the Pentagon has leveled is to invoke the Defense Production Act to, essentially, I suppose, like force Anthropic to let the Pentagon use Claude as it sees fit.
Well, they come together. So Anthropic's potential failure to comply with the Defense Production Act then leads to the classification of the supply chain risk. So one will follow the other. And as you said, there is this deadline for Friday, which is tomorrow. Again, it shows how important Claude is to the Pentagon and how high the stakes they've raised.
So, what would it mean, for example, if Anthropic caves and says to the Pentagon, they look at their bottom line, they see the threats that the US government is imposing upon them, threatening their bottom line in significant ways. What if Anthropic just says, all right, you win, we'll take the money, you can use Claude against our terms of services as you see fit?
My view is this is likely to happen. We'll wait and see. But a lot of people are expecting this will happen. I mean, Anthropic is on the money in terms of general public sentiment with what they want. And so there will be a further undermining of the general public's trust in the AI that they use and also in how their represented government uses it. I think Anthropic has built its reputation to be known as the safety conscious AI company out of all the others. So there is an element of public perception and Anthropic's own identity as a company that they are grappling with.
I would also presume that's like the likely outcome. That I don't know if this is like the hill that Anthropic wants to die on when they're already winning the AI race in terms of the capabilities that Claude has compared to the other models. On the other hand, what if Anthropic holds firm? Like, what are the potential implications there?
They would have to review their list of clients. This would be a significant shift in their annual revenue and their strategy to provide AI to the US public service. I mean, they generate a lot of revenue as well from private companies, industry, everyday people. But Anthropic has signaled that it is very important to them that they provide their systems to the US government. So it would serve as a real blow to their company.
It seems to me like one of the reasons that the Pentagon is seeking this expansive use of Claude that maybe potentially wants to, develop these like lethal autonomous weapons systems is because they see that their competitors out in the world, say China, doing the same thing, and they don't want to be at a disadvantage vis-a-vis China in the upcoming, drone swarm wars, which speaks to me about something you and I chatted about last time, the need for like international rules of the road about this. I mean, there are plenty of examples throughout history of adversaries coming together through a treaty or bilateral negotiations and agreeing to limit their weapons capabilities, judging certain weapons like chemical weapons or biological weapons as being beyond the pale, or in the case of nuclear weapons, agreeing to not test new nuclear weapons or agreeing to set limits on the amount of nuclear weapons that might be deployed. It seems that this dispute between Anthropic and the Pentagon suggests to me that like the time might be ripe for this kind of international agreement, potentially even like a bilateral agreement between the United States and China to limit the use of these potentially very dangerous lethal autonomous weapons systems.
Absolutely. I think history has shown it's difficult for humans to act preventatively. And in the case of high risk weapons, that definitely applies. For nuclear weapons, we needed to see them in use to understand the gravity. And I think with autonomous weapon systems, there is a lot of industry hype over their capabilities. We hear a lot of claims specifically on precision and that they will save lives. But this is not what we're seeing in real time on the battlefield. They present more risks than often they do benefits. We see, for example, in Ukraine that Ukrainian battalions are actually decreasing the level of autonomy in the systems because they're not providing that payoff of precision and military utility. But even if they do, with this golden idea of precision, autonomous weapons are not like nuclear weapons in that they are very accessible. Some of them are cheap, some are expensive, some you can make in your own garage with facial recognition sensors, a hobby drone, and you weaponize it. That's an autonomous weapon too, that can inflict a lot of harm on a mass scale. So there's a proliferation risk and a misuse risk that comes into play. And you mentioned that countries are debating over how to provide international governance on this. So there is a draft treaty, if you will, that exists, that is being formulated, worked on, refined, and negotiated at the UN with a vast majority of countries who want a legally binding instrument over autonomous weapons. Now, this wouldn't be an outright ban like we've seen for landmines or cluster munitions or biological chemical weapons. It says those systems that can't be used with meaningful human control should be prohibited, and those that can would be regulated. And many of the systems we see in use today would be regulated rather than prohibited. So it is a permissive attempt at a treaty that can satisfy a lot of countries and stakeholders, the users, as well as those that would have them used against them. The Secretary General of the UN and the ICRC president has given 2026 as a deadline, the end of this year, for states to negotiate this. We will see if that happens, but everything is there lined up for them. They have an excellent treaty text to go. It's the political will that we need.
It just seems to me that this dispute really does demonstrate the need for this kind of international agreement. Like, we wouldn't be having this conversation if the Pentagon could, say, be assured that China also wasn't developing these kinds of systems. And a treaty is kind of what gives you that assurance.
I think also we're seeing the civilian and military dual use nature of these systems are starting to blur. For example, military AI is now creeping out of armed conflicts and into suburban streets in peacetime. The AI decision support systems that we see used by ICE or US border control are very similar to decision support systems that we see in Gaza and Ukraine. The system gives you a target recommendation. It's just the action that is different. Is it for deportation or is it to strike, to kill? But the system of scraping data on a particular person, your residence, where you live, what time you leave the house, who you talk to, who you're friends with on Facebook, all of that is put together to make a target recommendation. And it's just the action that is different. So the siloing, if you will, of autonomous weapons are just in conflict zones and we don't encounter military AI. That is no longer the case. It is seeping into our civilian lives. And this is what happens. The weapons that we use in conflicts start to be used by police, border force, also non-state actors. So the proliferation aspect has begun.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you to you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.